Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're cracking open one of the Bible's most pivotal and, frankly, mysterious books, Deuteronomy. This isn't just some dusty old text. This is a document that kicked off a massive religious revolution, deeply influenced the teachings of Jesus, and its origin story, well, it plays out like a high-stakes political thriller.
So our story really kicks off with this bombshell announcement back in 7th century BCE Jerusalem. You've got a high priest, a supposedly lost scroll, and a king who is absolutely terrified by what it says. This one moment, this discovery recorded in the book of 2 Kings, was enough to send an entire kingdom spiraling into a spiritual and political crisis.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the discovery itself. Then we'll zoom out and see the political mess that made this scroll so explosive. We'll dig into who really wrote this thing and what they were trying to achieve, break down its really contradictory message of brutal laws and radical love, and then we'll follow its legacy all the way into the Gospels. Okay, let's get right into it. The king's discovery. I want you to picture this. The year is 622 BCE. We're in Jerusalem, the capital of what's left of the Israelite kingdom, the southern part, called Judah. And right at the center of it all is this young, ambitious king named Josiah. He is desperate to reform his nation and, honestly, just make sure it survives. So Josiah's got this big project going on. He's cleaning up the temple, getting rid of idols, that sort of thing. And right in the middle of all this work, the high priest, a guy named Hilkiah, comes out holding a scroll. And he claims it's a long-lost scroll of the Torah, which is like the foundational legal code of Israel. Now, on the surface, this looks amazing, right? A miracle. It seems like a sign from God that Josiah is totally on the right track. But here's where the story takes a sharp turn. When the scroll is actually read to King Josiah, he doesn't celebrate. He doesn't throw a party. No, he does something much more dramatic. He tears his royal robes. And let me tell you, this isn't just for show. In that culture, that's an act of pure terror and grief. It's a sign that whatever he just heard on that scroll was absolutely devastating.
So this is our central question. What in the world was written on that scroll? Why was he so distraught? He immediately sends his top guys to a prophetess named Huldah, and she basically confirms his worst fears. She says, yep, the scroll's the real deal, and because you all have been ignoring these laws for centuries, your kingdom is toast. It's doomed. So you have to wonder, what could it possibly say?
To really get why this scroll was like a bomb going off, we have to understand the context. This discovery didn't happen in a vacuum. It landed in the middle of a nation that was already dealing with some serious, long-term trauma and anxiety.
So let's rewind the clock a little. Way back in 920 BCE, the big unified kingdom of Israel splits into two. You get the northern kingdom, called Israel, and the southern kingdom, called Judah, where Jerusalem is. Fast forward to 720 BCE, and disaster strikes. The massive Assyrian Empire rolls in and just completely wipes the northern kingdom off the map. So when Josiah becomes king in 640 BCE, he's ruling a survivor state, constantly looking over its shoulder, terrified the same thing is going to happen to them. And see, the Assyrians didn't just conquer the north, they deported huge chunks of the population, scattering them all over their empire until they just vanished. We call them the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Now, for the people in the south, in Judah, this was way more than just a military loss. They saw it as God's judgment, a punishment because their northern brothers had worshipped other gods and hadn't been faithful. And that fear, the fear of divine punishment, is the key that unlocks this entire story.
So how does all that national trauma connect to this scroll they found in the temple? Well, this is where the detective work really starts. Because it turns out this crisis is exactly what shaped the book Josiah discovered, the book we now call Deuteronomy. And as we're about to see, most scholars today think this was no accident at all.
And this really gets to the heart of it. The whole understanding of this book has radically shifted. For centuries, the view was that this was a genuinely ancient book written by Moses way back around 1400 BCE. But now the scholarly consensus, which builds on something called the documentary hypothesis and the work of scholars like Julius Wellhausen, is that Deuteronomy was actually written in the 7th century BCE, right around the time it was found, which strongly suggests the discovery was staged. Think about it. It's a brilliant political move. You write a new reform document, and then you discover it, claiming it's from the ancient lawgiver Moses himself. Who's going to argue with that?
Scholars have a name for this author, or more likely this group of authors, the Deuteronomist. A scholar named Martin Noth was the one who really showed how this unique writing style and theological viewpoint don't just stop with Deuteronomy. They run all the way through the next few books of the Bible, creating one long, unified history. And this Deuteronomist had a very clear goal, born directly out of the trauma of the North's destruction: push a radical religious reform. The agenda was simple: one God, one temple in Jerusalem, and absolute loyalty, or else Judah would suffer the exact same fate.
Okay, so we've got the who and the why. Now let's look at the what. What does this book actually say? Because it is a book born of crisis, and its message is this fascinating and kind of jarring mix of fear and hope, of really harsh laws and incredibly radical love.
First off, this text is intense. It completely reflects the desperate times it was written in. It is just filled with these severe, terrifying curses for anyone who disobeys the law. It demands absolute, exclusive loyalty to God and lays out the harshest punishments, including death, for anyone who even thinks about worshiping another god. This is almost certainly the part of the scroll that made Josiah tear his robes. He heard this list of curses and realized, oh no, my people are guilty of all of these.
But then, and this is the incredible part, right alongside all that fire and brimstone, you find some of the most beautiful and influential ethical teachings in the entire Bible. It's in Deuteronomy that we get the command to love God with all your heart and soul, and crucially, it doesn't stop there. It extends that same ethic to other people, demanding justice and kindness for society's most vulnerable: the immigrant, the widow, the orphan.
The reason why they have to do this is what makes it so revolutionary. The book constantly bases its commands for justice on the nation's own memory of being oppressed. The logic is just groundbreaking. Hey, you all, remember when you were slaves in Egypt? Remember how awful that was? Well, because you know what that feels like, you now have a sacred duty to protect the vulnerable in your own land. This idea that shared suffering should create empathy is one of Deuteronomy's most powerful gifts to the world.
Now you might think the story of this document kind of ends there, with Josiah's reform in the 7th century BCE, but that's not even close. Its influence explodes from this point forward, and it becomes absolutely foundational for the central figure of the New Testament.
I mean, it is just impossible to overstate how much Deuteronomy influenced the Gospels. It is the #1 most quoted book from the Hebrew Bible by Jesus and the Gospel writers. Think about it. When Jesus is asked to name the single greatest commandment, where does he turn? Deuteronomy chapter 6. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. His constant focus on justice for the poor, that's pure Deuteronomy. It shows that Jesus wasn't just inventing his message out of thin air. He was tapping into this powerful, radical, ethical tradition that was already deep within his own scriptures.
And understanding this history also helps us decode some really key terms that can be confusing for us today. Take the title Son of God. In the world of Deuteronomy and the Israelite kings, that was a royal title. It meant the king had a special, adopted relationship with God, but it didn't mean he was God. Now compare that to the title Jesus often used for himself, Son of Man. That comes from the later book of Daniel and refers to this powerful, divine-like figure who comes to judge the world. So for his original audience, hearing Jesus call himself the Son of Man would have been a much bigger, more shocking claim to divinity than hearing him called Son of God.
And this really brings us to the big takeaway. Once you stop seeing Deuteronomy as this static book that just fell out of the sky and instead see it as a passionate, very human document forged in a moment of intense national crisis, well, the whole thing just opens up. It becomes this incredible testament to how people use faith and history and law to respond to trauma and just fight for their own survival. It reminds us that even our most sacred texts have a history, an agenda, and a very human story behind them, a story of fear, of hope, and of a radical new vision for what a just society could look like.